late afternoon sun hung low over the jagged canyons surrounding Redstone, bleeding the sky in streaks of gold and orange. Heat shimmered off the dusty main street, and the air stank of horse sweat, dust, and old timber. A gathering of townsfolk milled in the square, their faces drawn, eyes flickering with unease. Whispered words passed between them, like dry leaves scraping across the ground, too faint to catch but heavy with dread. The cause of it all stood in the middle of the square, a young woman bound to a weather-worn post, her wrists tied with coarse rope, her face streaked with sweat and dust. Eliza Cade's chestnut hair clung to her skin, her lips cracked from the dry heat. Yet her green eyes held no fear. There was a quiet defiance in her gaze, the kind that made men uncomfortable in a land where survival was bought with silence. A hush fell over the gathering as a heavy-set figure strode from the saloon's shade. Clem Harlan. The name alone was enough to stiffen spines and silence conversations in Redstone. Broad-shouldered, gray-bearded, and thick around the middle, Clem walked with the air of a man who'd long forgotten the taste of anyone telling him no. His black coat was dusty, his boots caked in dry mud, and his eyes held the cold sheen of a man who saw other people as tools, obstacles, or property. Behind him trailed his son, Wade Harlan, a mean-eyed brute of a man whose smile always came crooked and cruel. Wade's hand rested lazily on the butt of his revolver as he scanned the crowd, daring someone to look away or speak up. Clem came to a stop before the post and turned to the gathering. His voice, thick as gravel, carried over the square. "Listen up, folks," he began, a mocking grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "This here's what happens when a woman forgets her place, when she thinks she can spit on a man's name, on my son's name." The townsfolk remained silent, though a few shifted uncomfortably on their feet. An old woman clutched her shawl tighter. A young boy clung to his mother's skirt. "Miss Eliza Cade." Clem sneered, decided she was too good for my Wade, said she'd rather rot in the dust than be a Harlan, said a woman's got the right to say no. He spat on the ground, a wet blotch in the dust. "Well, I say a woman in this town's got the right to do as she's told, or face what comes." Clem's eyes swept over the gathering, daring anyone to disagree. No one did. "I'm leaving her here," he declared, "bound and bare to the sun till her tongue remembers sense, or till it dries up for good." He tipped his hat back. "Let it be a lesson." A fly buzzed past Eliza's face. She didn't flinch. From the sidelines, Sheriff Jonas Doolan stood near the jailhouse steps, his thumbs hooked in his belt. A lean man with a graying mustache, Jonas had once worn his badge proud. Now it hung heavy on his chest, a reminder of the authority he'd long surrendered. He kept his eyes on the ground, unwilling to meet Eliza's stare. His silence said what needed saying. Clem Harlan owned Redstone, and no lawman worth his life would cross him. "Sheriff," someone whispered from the crowd. Doolan didn't move. Clem grunted in satisfaction, then turned on his heel. "I'll be in the saloon," he announced, "and I better not hear she's been cut down. Any man touches that rope answers to me." The Harlan Riders, a half-dozen dust-caked thugs, took up positions around the square, leaning against posts and hitching rails, hands never far from their pistols. The town settled into a tense, watching quiet as Clem disappeared through the swinging doors of the saloon. The sun slid lower, its light thick and angry. The earth cracked underfoot, and the air seemed to hum with the relentless heat. A vulture circled high above, its silhouette gliding across the fading sky. Then, from the far end of town, a solitary rider appeared. He came from the canyon road, leading a mottled-dun mare, his pace unhurried. Dust clung to his clothes, a plain, sweat-stained shirt, dark trousers, and a battered wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. A wiry man in his 50s, narrow-shouldered, but carrying himself like a coiled whip. Some recognized him. Most didn't. "Luther Kane," someone murmured, barely audible. Kane didn't stop as he passed the livery, nor when he moved by the general store where two boys sat in the shade, eyes wide. He didn't speak when he reached the edge of the square, his gaze settling on the figure bound to the post. His expression didn't change, though something flickered in his dark eyes. He brought his horse to a stop by the hitching rail, tied the reins loosely, and stepped down. The spurs on his boots gave a soft chime against the dry ground. Nobody spoke. Cain moved like a man with no need for hurry, his presence an old habit of forgotten storms. He crossed to the trough outside the saloon, cupped a palmful of water, and drank. Then he straightened, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and turned to face the square. His eyes met Eliza's. Neither spoke. A wind picked up, stirring the dust in lazy spirals. The sun hung like a vengeful god, and the town of Redstone held its collective breath. Luther Cain stood alone in the square, watching, waiting. The first stone had been cast. The dust of old grudges stirred once more, and the reckoning was not far behind. Redstone had always been a hard place. The land was dry, the wind sharp, and the men meaner still. But it hadn't always been ruled by one name. Years back, it was a patchwork of small ranchers and traders, a town strung together by grit and cattle runs. That changed the day Clem Harlan laid claim to the valley's only spring. Water in a land like this was power, and Clem took it the way men like him always did, with coin in one hand and a pistol in the other. Within 5 years, Clem owned most of the grazing lands and the best of the herds. What land he didn't buy, he took through debts, bad deals, or sheer brute force. Those who crossed him vanished or ended up dead in dry creek beds. The sheriff, once a hard-edged lawman, had been worn down by threats, money, and the weight of funerals. Now Jonas Doolin kept his head low and his badge polished, saying little and seeing less. The Harlan Riders made sure of that, a pack of hard-eyed saddle tramps and killers. The Riders wore no official badge, but carried Clem's word like law. They collected debts, ran off stubborn settlers, and kept the town in line. Their leader, Wade Harlan, was worse than his father in all the ways that counted, cruel, quick to temper, and proud of it. Everyone in Redstone knew it, and none spoke of it aloud. Eliza Cade had once known a different life. The daughter of Tom Cade, a rancher who spread butted up against Harlan land. She grew up with the scent of sagebrush and horses in her hair, sunburn on her shoulders, and calluses on her hands. Tom was a stubborn man, the kind who didn't bend easy. But Clem Harlan was patient. When Tom wouldn't sell, Clem dammed up the water, rustled his cattle, and drove off his hired men with whispers and threats. Within a season, the Cade ranch was dust and broken fences. Eliza was 16 when her father was found hanged from the cottonwood tree behind the bunkhouse. They called it a suicide. No one asked questions. With nowhere to go, Eliza was brought to the Harlan ranch to work off the debts her father left behind, a polite word for indentured servitude. But where others cowed, Eliza didn't. She spoke her mind, fought back when cornered, and once tried to flee toward the border. Wade and the Riders caught her by the old riverbed and dragged her back, bruised but unbroken. Since then, she worked under watchful eyes, serving in the house and the barn, but her defiance lingered, a stubborn ember Clem couldn't stamp out. As the day dragged into evening, Luther Cain moved through Redstone with the quiet patience of a man accustomed to watching rather than speaking. In the saloon, he ordered a glass of water and nursed it, his gaze flickering over the gambling tables and oil lamps. Men spoke in hushed tones, avoiding mention of the square or the girl still bound in the heat. At the livery, Cain spoke to old Tom Briggs, the stable master, asking about feed and horseshoeing, though his real questions lay beneath the surface. "Girl's got fire," Briggs muttered, glancing toward the square. "Damn shame. Clem will break her or bury her. Always does." Cain nodded, eyes narrowing. In the general store, Cain bought a coil of rope and a tin of tobacco. The storekeep, Ellis Cobb, studied him a moment before venturing. "Don't mean to pry, stranger, but you aim on sticking. Round these parts?" "Maybe," Cain replied softly, laying a silver dollar on the counter. "Depends how long the shadows stretch." It was enough to unsettle the man. Rumors swirled in Redstone about Luther Cain. Some said he'd once ridden with Texas Rangers. Others swore he'd worked cattle south of the border, traded hides with Comanches, or hunted bandits for bounty. All anyone knew for sure was that he kept to himself, ran cattle on the far side of the Badlands, and had eyes like a hawk scanning the horizon. And now, for the first time in years, he was in town. Near sundown, Cain passed by the old mercantile barn and spotted a scene he'd seen too many times in too many towns. A bent, wiry man, Ephraim Doss, was being shoved hard against a fence post by a burly Harlan rider named Jed Smaller. "Rent's due," Smaller snarled. "Ain't got it, old man. You best start digging a hole." Ephraim stammered, his face bloodied. Cain stepped into the alley, without a word. His boots crunched softly on the gravel. Smaller glanced up, grinned, and spat. "Get lost, Cain. Ain't none of your concern." Cain said nothing, just kept walking forward. Something in his eyes made Smaller falter. The grin slipped. His hand hovered near his pistol, then hesitated. Cain came within arm's reach, close enough that his voice, low and even, could be heard. "Go home, Jed." The words were simple. No threat, no bluster, but the weight of them hung like a stone in the air. Smaller's Adam's apple bobbed. His fingers twitched, then dropped away from the pistol. "Was just collecting his all," he muttered, backing off. Cain never took his eyes off him until Smaller vanished into the alley's deeper shadows. Ephraim sagged to his knees, wheezing. "You all right, old-timer?" Cain asked. Ephraim nodded. "You shouldn't have done that." "Maybe not," Cain replied, then left him sitting in the dust. Out in the square, the last light of day fled beyond the canyons, the land turning the color of old brass. The townsfolk drifted home in twos and threes, leaving behind a silence more suffocating than the heat had been. Eliza remained tied to the post, her lips dry and cracked, her head lolled to one side, her skin feverish from the sun. The world blurred around her, shapes melting into one another. She saw her mother's face in the clouds, heard her father's voice calling her from the hills, and smelled the wild lavender that used to bloom by the river. She imagined herself running again, hair flying, free and unafraid, the world wide open before her. But the rope bit into her wrists, and the night settled heavy. The coyotes began to cry out on the ridgelines, their howls carrying across the open land like lost, mournful spirits. The stars blinked to life, and the wind brought with it the chill of the coming dark. Not a soul dared approach her. Only the shadows watched, and one lone man, who did not look away. The night draped itself over Redstone like a heavy, black curtain. The stars scattered thick across the sky. The heat of the day had broken, leaving the land cool and brittle, the kind of chill that gnawed at bone after sundown. Crickets sang in the brush, and the wind stirred lazy eddies of dust in the empty streets. The town had long since gone quiet. Saloon lamps dimmed, doors bolted, and shutters drawn. Only the coyotes and the restless dead still prowled. But one figure moved through the gloom with the careful patience of a man used to slipping between shadows. Luther Cain approached the square on foot, his long coat trailing behind him like a faded banner. The only sound was the soft scuff of his boots in the dust and the occasional creak of a hanging sign in the wind. He stopped a dozen paces from the post. Eliza Cade hung limp against the weathered timber, her wrist still bound, head drooped. In the moon's pale light, her face looked ghostly, pale and streaked with grime. Cain stood there a moment, watching her chest rise and fall. She was alive, just barely. He stepped closer, his voice low and steady, a whisper carried by the night. "Eliza," he said. She stirred, eyelids fluttering, lips cracking as she tried to wet them with a tongue too dry to move. A flicker of recognition passed through her fevered gaze. He crouched down beside her, producing a small knife with a worn bone handle. The edge caught the light as he raised it. "No one owns you now," Cain murmured. With a quick, practiced stroke, he sliced through the rope binding her wrists. The fibers parted with a soft snap, and her arms fell to her sides like dead weight. She slumped forward, but Cain caught her, easing her down into the dust. She gasped, blinking rapidly, her parched throat working soundlessly. "Easy," Cain told her, slipping a canteen from his belt and pressing it to her lips. She drank greedily, the water spilling down her chin. Through the haze, Eliza's mind grasped onto his face, half hidden beneath the brim of his hat, and the strange calm in his voice. She knew his name. Everyone did. Cain, the cattleman who lived alone out in the Badlands. The man who spoke to no one and smiled at nothing. You came, she rasped. Had to. A distant clatter of hooves broke the quiet. Kane's head snapped up. In the moonlight, two shapes moved at the far end of the street. Harlan riders, making their rounds. The riders weren't smart, but they were mean, and worse, loyal. Kane's jaw tightened. Time to move. He slung Eliza's arm over his shoulder and half-carried, half-dragged her toward the alley behind the mercantile. The pair reached the corner just as the riders turned into the square. There, one of them shouted. The muzzle flash of a pistol cracked the night. Kane ducked into the shadows, pressing Eliza against the wall. Hold tight, he whispered. Before she could protest, he slipped into the open, a shape of moving shadow, silent and swift. The first rider barely registered the glint of the thrown knife before it buried itself in his throat. He toppled from the saddle with a wet gurgle, his boots dragging in the dirt. The second rider pulled his gun, but Kane was already on him. With a twist, Kane grabbed the man's wrist, wrenched it aside, and drove the heel of his hand into his jaw. The pistol clattered to the ground. The rider staggered back, wide-eyed, blood on his lip. You want to draw, boy? Kane said low. The rider glanced at his dead companion, then back at Kane. Whatever courage he'd had left him, he turned tail and spurred his horse, disappearing into the dark with a cloud of dust in his wake. Kane scooped up the fallen revolver and tucked it into his belt. Can you ride? He asked Eliza, returning to her side. She managed a nod, though her legs trembled. They made their way to Kane's dun mare tied behind the livery. He lifted her into the saddle and swung up behind her. With a quiet click of his tongue, the horse moved into a canter, carrying them out of Redstone and into the waiting canyons. They rode hard through the night, the narrow trail winding between towering walls of stone. The stars stretched overhead in brilliant swaths, and the air smelled of dust, juniper, and old ghosts. After an hour, Kane slowed the mare and guided her toward a narrow gap in the rocks. The land opened to a small hollow where a half-collapsed shack leaned against a boulder, the long-forgotten refuge of some prospector long dead. This'll do, Kane said. He dismounted and helped Eliza down, steadying her as her legs threatened to buckle. Inside, the shack was little more than a broken table, a rusted stove, and a cot with a threadbare blanket. Kane fetched water from a hidden spring nearby and tended her wounds with care that spoke of long practice. By the time the moon hung low, Eliza sat by a flickering lantern, cradling a tin cup of water, her hands trembling more from fury than weakness. Why'd you come for me? She asked. Kane sat opposite, his face lined with shadows. Didn't like the look of it, he answered simply. That it? She asked, a faint trace of a smirk at the corner of her cracked lips. Kane sighed, leaning back against the wall. Long time ago, he began. I wore a badge. Marshal over in Baxter County. Had a wife. 2 kids. Had a ranch near the river. Clem Harlan was just starting then, running whiskey and rustling cattle. I got in his way. His voice went flat, as if reading off a page already burned. One night, I came home to smoke and blood. They left my boy strung up in the barn, my little girl buried in the ash, and her. He reached into his coat, pulling a small, worn locket. Inside was a faded sketch of a woman with dark hair and kind eyes. My wife. Eliza swallowed hard. I tried to take them down, one by one. But Harlan had men. Money. The law turned its back. I buried the badge, took to cattle, and waited. Waited for what? Kane's gaze lifted to hers. For a reason. A long silence hung between them, broken only by the pop of the lantern's flame. I won't run, Eliza said at last. Her voice was steadier now, a strength beneath the weariness. I won't let him win. Kane studied her a moment, seeing not just the girl who defied Clem in the square, but something fiercer, something he remembered from long ago. It's a hard road, he warned. You stay on it, and you'll bleed. You'll lose things you didn't know you had. I've already lost everything, she said. What's left is mine to spend how I see fit. Kane gave a small, grim smile. Then we finished this. Out beyond the hollow, the wind stirred the canyon rocks, carrying with it the scent of dust and old blood. And somewhere in the far distance, a coyote howled. The reckoning had begun. The first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, turning the canyons to jagged teeth against the blood-red sky. The dry wind carried with it the scent of old dust and storm-heavy air. Out in the scrub, a lone vulture circled low, its shadow gliding silently across the ground. In the saloon, Clem Harlan woke to a rider bursting through the doors, his face pale and slick with sweat. "She's gone," the man stammered. "Eliza's gone. Jed's dead. Knife in the throat. Sam's missing." Clem's face darkened. The old land baron surged to his feet, snatching his hat from the table and jamming it onto his head. "Get every man riding for me," he snarled. "Now." Wade Harlan barged in from the back room, belt hastily buckled, his revolver already in hand. "What happened?" "Someone's cut the girl loose," Clem growled. "Left Jed bleeding in the street. Ain't no one gets away with that. Not in my town." Within the hour, the Harlan riders gathered, a ragged pack of hard men with pistols on their hips and murder in their eyes. Clem's orders were simple. Hunt them down, gut whoever stood in the way, and string them both up where everyone could see. But while Clem gathered his riders, Luther Kane had already set his plan in motion. Before the sky had turned gray, Kane sent a stable boy, Elias Burke, slipping through alleys and back doors with quiet instructions. Elias, a boy whose father had lost his land to Clem's debts, carried the word to men and women too long cowed by fear. "Come to the square at first light." The message went. "Bring what you've got. Axes, old rifles, shovels if need be. It's time." And one by one, hearts heavy but hands tightening on whatever tools they could find, the people of Redstone stirred. The land itself seemed to know what was coming. Dust devils twisted across the streets, stirring up bits of paper and dry leaves. The air hung thick, the scent of ozone sharp as a knife edge. High clouds bruised the sky, hinting at a storm that would break before nightfall. In the old livery stable, Kane and Eliza worked quickly. Kane unspooled ropes for tripwires, rigged powder kegs he'd found in the shed, and positioned the stalls as cover. He checked and rechecked the cylinder of his Colt, eyes scanning every window, every shadow. Eliza moved with him, her face pale but determined. A rifle, old but reliable, rested in her hands. Kane showed her how to brace it, how to aim, where to stand. "You sure about this?" Kane asked. "I won't crawl again," she said. "Not for Clem. Not for anyone." In that moment, the lantern light caught her face, and something struck Kane. A memory from long ago. A little girl, chasing fireflies by a riverbank. A smile, gap-toothed and full of life. His sister's child. A knot formed at his throat. "You're Annie's girl," he murmured. Eliza blinked. "What?" "My sister. Annie Cade. You've got her eyes." Eliza's hands trembled, the weight of it sinking in. "I didn't know," she whispered. Kane gave a tight nod. "Neither did I. But it makes no difference now. Blood's blood." A single church bell rang out from the old steeple, marking the hour. "It's time." As the riders thundered into the square, guns drawn, the townsfolk began to appear. At first, just a few, a weathered old miner with a scattergun, a blacksmith clutching a hammer, a mother gripping a hoe. Then more, stepping from doorways and alleys, armed with whatever they could carry. Faces grim, eyes steady. Clem reined in his horse, sneering at the sight. "You fools think you can stand against me," he bellowed. "I own this town." "No, Clem," came a voice from the shadows. "Not anymore." Kane stepped out into view, his coat flaring in the wind, his Colt steady in his hand. Murmurs rippled through the gathering. "Lucas Kane," someone breathed. "It's him, the lawman." An old man near the well squinted, recognition dawning. "Hell," the prospector muttered. "Thought you were dead." Kane gave a grim, humorless smile. "Not yet." Wade Harlan snarled, spurring his horse forward. "Kill them all." Gunfire erupted, a dozen muzzles flashing at once. Kane dropped low, his first shot catching a rider clean in the chest. A tripwire snapped taut under a galloping horse, sending the beast crashing down, its rider thrown headfirst into the dirt. Eliza fired from the stable window, the old rifle kicking against her shoulder. A rider screamed, clutching his side, and tumbled from his saddle. A powder keg Kane had rigged to a stall wall exploded, sending flame and debris into the street. Horses screamed, bolting in every direction. The townsfolk moved in. A tide of anger and old grudges made flesh. The blacksmith brought his hammer down on a rider's skull. A farmer drove a pitchfork into a man's chest. Even the preacher swung an iron poker with the weight of 2 decades of fear behind it. The fight was chaos. Smoke and dust clouded the air. Horses reared and fell. Shots cracked off stone and timber. Eliza ducked low as a bullet split the beam above her head. Another rider charged the stable door, revolver raised. Eliza didn't hesitate. She fired once, the shot catching him in the throat. The man toppled, dead before he hit the ground. Her hands shook, her breathing ragged, but she reloaded. In the square, Kane moved like a storm, precise, unflinching. Every shot found its mark, every step calculated. He fought not for vengeance now, but to break a chain that had bound this town for too long. And for her. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, half the riders lay dead or dying. The rest broke, their nerves shattered. The townsfolk, those long silent and small beneath Clem's boot, stood taller now, bloodied but unbowed. Clem Harlan, his face a mask of fury, tried to rally, but even Wade hesitated. The tide had turned. Fall back. Clem shouted. Fall back, damn you. But there was nowhere left to run. The morning light bled slow and red over Redstone Square, revealing a town forever changed. Smoke clung to the air in lazy curls, the acrid stench of black powder mixing with blood and dust. The streets were littered with bodies, rough men who had, until this day, carried Clem Harlan's were like iron chains. Now they lay sprawled in the dirt, eyes wide to a sky that no longer belonged to them. One by one, the Harlan riders had fallen, some by bullet, some by blade, some by the hands of the very people they'd once cowed. The blacksmith, face bloodied and hammer still in hand, stood over a man he'd known since boyhood, his expression blank. A mother wept, not from grief, but from the weight lifting off her shoulders after years of quiet submission. The last of Clem's men fled before the sun fully broke the horizon, those with sense enough to know when a reign had ended. Wade Harlan, his face bloodied and jaw broken from the stock of Kane's colt, had crawled into the dust and was nowhere to be seen. Only Clem Harlan remained, standing alone in the square. His black coat was streaked with dirt and blood, the wide brim of his hat missing, his hair plastered to his face. Yet even cornered, the old man's eyes still burned with venom. His revolver hung limp at his side, his face twisted in hatred. Come on, then. Clem barked at the gathering, spittle flying from his cracked lips. You think this town's yours now? You think some old ghost and a girl with dirt on her face can unmake me? The townsfolk held their distance, weapons still in hand, wary. The years of fear clung tight. But Luther Kane stepped forward. He walked slow, his long coat swaying, boots crunching over broken glass and spent shells. In the dawn's light, the lines on his face looked cut from stone. The town fell into a hush as he approached Clem, the legend reborn in flesh and dust. Long time coming, Clem, Kane said, his voice low, steady as an old sermon. Clem gave a bitter laugh. Lucas Kane, he spat. I should have killed you proper when I had the chance. You tried, Kane replied. His hand hovered near his colt. And you took my family. You took half this town's soul. Now it's time to answer for it. Clem squared his shoulders, sneering. What are you waiting for then? Gun me down like a dog. That it. Think you'll sleep better for it. A voice cut through the tension. No, Eliza said, stepping forward, rifle gripped tight. Her hair matted, her face streaked with dust but unbroken. That's my right. Clem's eyes flicked to her, and for the first time, a glimmer of unease crossed his face. You don't know what you're meddling in, girl. Clem growled. I know enough. She shot back. Kane looked at her, and something unspoken passed between them. He saw it now. Not just the flash of Annie's eyes, but the sharp line of the jaw, the stubborn set of her chin. It had been there all along. Eliza, he said quietly, there's something you ought to know. She met his gaze, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through her anger. What? You ain't just Tom Cade's girl. You're my blood, my sister's child. Annie Cade. Eliza's breath caught, the rifle sagging a little in her hands. My mother was Annie Cade, she whispered, voice trembling. Kane nodded. She sent you away when Clem's men came for us. Changed your name, hid you with Tom, thinking it might save you. Clem barked a harsh, humorless laugh. Would have saved her, too, if she'd kept her mouth shut. Kane's eyes darkened, his voice dropping to a growl. You murdered my sister, burned her and her children to ash. You think this land was built on kindness? Clem sneered. Built it with blood, Kane. Yours, hers, and every fool who stood in my way. Not anymore, Eliza said. She raised the rifle. Clem's smirk faltered. The old man's hand twitched toward his revolver, but Eliza was faster. The crack of the shot shattered the morning stillness. Clem staggered, a red bloom spreading across his chest. He swayed for a moment, a look of surprise flashing across his face, as if he'd believed himself immortal. Then Clem Harlan, tired of Redstone, toppled into the dust. The townsfolk watched in silence, the weight of decades crumbling in a heartbeat. No cheers rose, no victory shouts. Just a long, collective exhale. Sheriff Jonas Doolan stepped forward, the badge he'd worn too long heavy in his hand. He looked at Kane, then at the people. I should have done this years ago, he muttered. And with that, he unpinned the badge from his chest and dropped it onto Clem's lifeless body. I'm done, Doolan said, turning and walking away. One by one, the people of Redstone began to move. The blacksmith tossed aside his hammer. Mothers gathered their children. The saloon keeper began sweeping glass from the doorway. The town, long held in fear, now belonged to itself. Later that day, as the sun climbed high and the dust of battle settled, Eliza stood on the old Cade land, her land now. The broken fences and scorched earth would take years to mend, but it was hers. And it would be a place where no one was owned, no one was silenced. You sure about this? Kane asked, watching her as she surveyed the barren stretch. I have to be, she said, smiling faintly. Somebody has to make it right. He nodded. Got a name for it yet? She thought for a moment. Redemption Ranch. A fitting name, Kane reckoned. She looked at him, eyes softer now. A connection forged in blood and war. You'll stay. Kane glanced toward the horizon, where the canyons beckoned. I ain't built for towns, he said, or peace. But I'll be back through. You've got family now, whether you want it or not. Eliza swallowed past the lump in her throat, then stepped forward, embracing him. Kane stiffened at first, then let his hand rest lightly on her shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. He pulled back, a rare smile ghosting across his face. Take care, Annie's girl. And with that, Lucas Kane swung into the saddle, his battered wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Without fanfare, without a backward glance, he rode toward the Badlands, the dust rising in his wake. The town watched him go, the figure growing smaller against the vast, open land, a legend reborn in the telling. Years later, around a flickering campfire in a canyon gulch, an old prospector told the story to a pair of young drifters, the firelight catching the deep lines of his face. They say Redstone was ruled by a devil once, the old man said, voice rough as gravel. A man named Clem Harlan. But one dawn, justice came riding in, a ghost from the old days. Lucas Kane. Thought he was dead. Turns out, some men don't die easy. The fire crackled. And the girl? The younger drifter asked. What happened to her? Her, the old man chuckled. Took back the land. Ran off the outlaws. Built a place folks could live without fear. Redemption Ranch, they called it. Still there, if you ride far enough west. The drifters leaned in, the story settling like dust in the air. Some say Kane still rides the canyons, the prospector finished, his eyes gleaming. Watchin'. Waitin'. 'Cause the frontier don't never stay quiet for long. The coyotes howled somewhere out in the dark, and the story passed on.